Hola y'all, welcome back to my channel. It is Shelly Flowers Reads and Writes. I'm Michelle Flores, and on this channel I talk about all things related to reading and writing. So today I am kind of rushing to make this video because I had a plan and I've decided to change a few things, but basically it's Father's Day and it is also the end of the queer Blackathon. So I just wanted to talk about some books that I read, not just this past weekend, but in the past few weeks that I think could really fit in with anybody who's looking to read more books by queer Black authors or books that feature queer Black characters. So I have 5 books that I want to talk about, and let's dive into it. First up, we have Homie by Danez Smith. This is actually not the real title of this book. I cannot say the real title of this book, but it is a beautiful collection of poetry by one of my favorite poets. I rated this book 4 stars. Their last book I rated 5 stars, Don't Call Us Dead. This book I think was really well done, but personally I know a lot of this book was not meant for me, and so I didn't necessarily get that like deeper emotional connection that I did with their previous book. That being said though, like Danez Smith is just a master at their craft, and so I highly recommend this book if you're looking to read poetry, and especially poetry by non-binary Black poets. This is an excellent choice. It's also just like a combination of really fun, really poignant, really angry poetry all mixed into one, and I think that is what makes this book really special. The next book I would like to recommend is Intergalactic Travels by Alan Belaez Lopez. They are a non-binary Afro-Indigenous poet. They were formerly undocumented, hailing from Oaxaca, Mexico. They crossed the border when they were 5 years old, and I believe they recently got papers, but it has been a very arduous journey in terms of, you know, becoming a documented immigrant into this country. They are a migrant scribble on Instagram. I highly suggest you follow them. They also host writing workshops every Sunday with another queer Black Mexican poet, Ariana Brown. Every Sunday, I'll link to their channel down below. Those writing exercises are super fun, and you know, even if you can't meet them live, they save the recording so you can always go back and write poems with them. But this book is incredible. Like, calling it a book might not necessarily be the most accurate term. It's definitely almost like a portfolio of work. There's art pieces that Alan has worked on. There are also these forms that look like immigration forms that they have, you know, created more creative responses to. It honestly is sort of just like an opus, and this work really did challenge my understanding of gender, Latinidad, immigration, all of these things that we don't necessarily associate when we think about Black literature, but we have to keep in mind that undocumented immigration affects Black people just as much as any other group of people. And we also need to keep in mind that Mexico did not recognize its Black population until the past like 5 years, I believe. So there's a lot of discrimination in Latin American countries towards Afro-descendant people, especially if they're Black presenting, and this book is a really excellent example of how that can look. I also think just structurally this book is so very different from anything I've read before. I gave it 5 stars. I highly recommend anyone who's looking to read more poetry or more mixed media to definitely take this book into account. Okay, next up we have The Deep by River Solomon. This is a book that I have seen on BookTube. I think this is one of the first books I bought because I saw other people talking so highly about it on BookTube. It tells the story of the Wajinru, who are descendants of enslaved people who were pregnant and thrown overboard or threw themselves overboard during the transatlantic slave trade on the Middle Passage. That is a very heavy, heavy premise, and what I really appreciate about this book, it does not go into the more traumatic aspects of stories that are about enslaved people tend to go to. Instead, it focuses on the relationship between one of the Wajinru and a woman who is like a human essentially and meets a Wajinru, and really just talks about the interaction between these two groups. It's honestly fascinating. I really loved this book. I thought the story itself was just so different than anything I've ever read before. And I think the treatment of gender especially was also really powerful. It kind of reminded me of Intergalactic Travels because there's this part in Intergalactic Travels where Alan talks about viewing their body as a seahorse, and I could see that like mer mythology kind of coming through in this as well. This idea of like gender not being specific to bodily functions and concepts like that that I just haven't been exposed to as much. So definitely recommend this book. 4 stars is what I gave it, and I think anytime you also have a cover where it's like holographic and features mer beings, I'm 100% on board for it. Okay, the next book I have is Meridian by Alice Walker. As you can see, this is a very old copy of this book. It's really beat up. This book I thought featured a bisexual main character when I picked it for the Queer Lit Readathon, but it turns out it doesn't actually feature a bisexual main character that we know of. I do know that Alice Walker is a bisexual author though. This book is about a woman named Meridian Hill and basically her coming into a leadership role within the civil rights movement. It's also a critique of the civil rights movement, so it takes place in like a fictional setting, but most of the events are based on real events. And so Meridian Hill is a student activist who has a very tumultuous life experience, to say the least. And I don't want to give too much away, but the thing with this book I do want to like clarify. I personally gave it 3 stars because I think there were so many essential questions and ideas presented in this book through the characters, and it's all stuff that I've been grappling with myself, right? When we think about activism, I think especially if you're younger, you tend to focus on the protesting aspect of things, the disruption, the anger, the rage, and all of that is necessary. But then there comes a time where policy changes need to take place, where voting needs to happen. And this book explores the balance between both, between making space for this rage and for this anger, but also recognizing that real lasting change needs to occur through a judicial and governmental process, right? So it's really interesting to see Meridian go through that mindset shift. And from what I've read, that's also how Alice Walker felt about the civil rights movement. That being said, though, there are a lot of really difficult scenes in this book, particularly for situations involving rape and sexual assault. So that is definitely a trigger warning if you know that those kinds of situations really trigger you. Maybe this might not be the best book for you. And that's honestly why I rated it 3 stars. This book was written in the 70s, or I think it was written in the 60s and then published in the 70s. But either way, I notice this happens a lot with older work, especially books and movies. They tend to be so graphic and almost flippant in the way that they treat sexual assault, because our understanding of what sexual assault is has truly evolved over the years. And so there's an entire chapter in this book where a woman is assaulted, but they don't call it rape because they don't feel like they can justifiably call it rape because nobody was beaten or tied down or anything like that. So I think those are all really important discussions to have. I just don't know that it was expressed in a way that holds up to our current understanding of what rape and sexual assault is. So that being said, the questions that are presented in this book are essential questions that anybody who's looking to do any kind of social justice work should be asking themselves. And for that, I definitely think that this is a very strong read for this time period especially. And the last book, I actually read this for the Queer Blackathon. This is Felix Ever After by Case and Calendar. I rated this book 3 stars, and while I loved the representation in this book, I do have to say that I just feel like I might be too old to read a book like this. It honestly reminded me a lot of Gossip Girl, shockingly enough, which I was not expecting, but essentially this story follows a demi boy named Felix who is struggling with his identity. He feels like overall he's just one marginalization too many, like a lot of synopses say, and that definitely comes through in the writing. That being said though, there were a lot of descriptions of like rich New York City kids going to parties and balls and galas, and while Felix himself is not particularly affluent, like it did come across to me as like, this is definitely a story about middle class to upper middle class kids gallivanting around New York City. Not a bad story. It actually reminded me a lot of my days when I was at NYU. I just personally found that a very difficult storyline to believe because I myself grew up with an extremely strict upbringing. So the idea that I could just spend weeks at a friend's house with no parental supervision is like a very difficult concept for me to buy into. That being said, that could be very realistic for some people. I don't know. I just know for me, some of those aspects of the parenting part of things just seemed a little bit unrealistic. What I really loved though was the conversations around, you know, being a parent of a trans child and helping them through their trans experience, but also, you know, going through that shift of realizing the life that you thought you had for your kid is no longer going to happen. This isn't to excuse parents who somehow abuse their kids or, you know, basically want to harm their kids because, you know, force them into a gender identity that they don't identify with. I'm not saying any of that, but I think that is a conversation that should be explored more, where these feelings come from, and as parents getting to that place where we understand if we're not willing to accept the entire identity of our kids, we should not be parents. And that's definitely something that I believe in for sure. But at the same time, abandoning your child is also not a good answer to that. So I think those kinds of questions were the most interesting ones to me. And it makes me wonder if maybe I just need to read more books of like cisgender parents of trans children and maybe formulate my understanding in that way. As a parent of very young children, I think it would be really helpful for me. So that's something that I'm considering doing. That being said though, I could 100% see that this book be incredibly valuable to my students. And I also feel like if I'd read this as a kid, my understanding of, you know, trans experiences might be totally different, or at least would have come to an understanding at a much younger age compared to now. So yeah, I can honestly say, like, I've never read a book like this before. I can honestly say that I have never read a book of fiction, like young adult fiction, about a trans experience. So that's something that I definitely need to work on, is making sure that I'm including more of that representation and identity in the books that I'm choosing to read. I also feel like Case and Calendar has a very easy, digestible writing style, which makes it really fun. Like, even though this book was 350 pages, I think it took me a few hours to read, honestly. So, you know, this was a really fun read, and I'm glad I got to do it. And I definitely recommend it to people. I just think for me, it didn't necessarily connect with me and speak to me in the way that it might have if I was either younger or had a very different upbringing than what Felix gets to go through in this book. Those are some books that I recommend for anyone who's looking to read more books by queer Black authors or about queer Black people. If you have any other suggestions, feel free to drop them in the comments below. I am always looking for new things to read, and I am always looking to diversify my reading. So definitely send me some recommendations below. That's it from me today. If you'd like to follow me on a more day-to-day basis, you can find me on Instagram, Tumblr, and Goodreads at Shelly Flowers. I post videos every Wednesday and Sunday. I hope you guys have a happy Father's Day and a wonderful rest of your week. Ciao, y'all.